So we're going to continue our story of infectious disease, and now we're going to, we've been through the different steps of infection, and our microbe has exited the body, and now we're going to start to talk more about where these microbes exist in the environment when they're between hosts, and also we're going to talk about transmission and some different categories of transmission or different methods by which pathogens are moved from one host to another. So this video clip we're going to talk about reservoirs of infection. These are where these pathogens persist in the environment. So a couple of concepts here, reservoirs and transmitters. So a reservoir, and there are many different types, that's just a location where pathogens are maintained or where they persist between hosts. So if they've exited one host, they're persisting in a reservoir until they move on to the next host. All right, so there are two types of living reservoirs. You can have animal reservoirs, which are non-human, and then human reservoirs. Animal reservoirs, in some instances, other types of animals, generally mammals, will serve as hosts for human pathogens. Not all, but in some cases there are infectious microbes that are hosted by other types of animals, which you guys know. Think about rabies. You guys know lots of different animals can get rabies, not just humans. So any infectious disease that can naturally spread from an animal host to a human host is called a zoonosis, S-I-S, zoonoses with an E is plural. And there are a number of these. So bubonic plague, for example, rabies, anthrax can be hosted by more than one type of animal other than humans. Salmonella bacteria, you're supposed to be careful about salmonella in chicken meat and eggs and so forth. Toxoplasma, we've already talked about that. That's a protozoan that can live in cats. And the cyst form of the protozoans are shed in the cat feces, and they tell pregnant women to be careful about changing the litter box so they don't get exposed to toxoplasma. So those are all examples of zoonoses, and then check out, there's a table in your textbook as well in this section that has more examples of those. Humans can be reservoirs for infection. So if you are actually currently ill with a pathogen, then you are technically a reservoir. You're just an actively ill reservoir. But at other times you might just be a carrier. So this organism is persisting or living inside of you. It's not causing any kind of outward disease symptoms. You don't know that you're sick, but you're functioning as a carrier. And we'll talk about different types of carriers, human carriers, in more detail shortly. Then there are the non-living reservoirs. So again, these are going to be sites where pathogens may be maintained or persist until they get picked up by a new host. So that can include soil, and you guys know that. There are lots of microorganisms, and in some cases pathogens that live in the soil. Water, food, air can contain microorganisms, obviously, and buildings, built structures can harbor some pathogens as well. Maybe you've heard of like black mold and living in the walls of buildings and so forth. So those would be non-living types of reservoirs. And some examples, the Clostridium bacteria that we talk about so much in this class cause a number of pretty horrible diseases. They normally and naturally live in the soil. They're common soil organisms. And lucky for us, they're anaerobes, so they don't often cause disease, but when they do cause disease, they get into an anaerobic environment in the body. It can be pretty severe. Water, contaminated water, can contain worm eggs, protozoans, bacteria, the whole gamish of microorganisms, especially if it's fecally contaminated. So some of this is just kind of what we consider common sense today. That fecal oral route of transmission is huge. So any body of water that's fecally contaminated is at risk of containing a lot of pathogenic microorganisms. All right, a transmitter is going to be an individual or an object from which an infection is actually acquired. Okay, I just mentioned that in some instances you may be harboring a microorganism that's pathogenic, And even though you're not actually sick from it, you don't have any symptoms or anything, you can still transmit that to other individuals. And so there are various human carrier states, and your textbook has a nice table that explains some of these. Some interesting graphics over here as well. Asymptomatic carriers, that is somebody who the organism is living on or inside them, but they have no symptoms of disease. A number of examples of these things like gonorrhea, genital herpes with no lesions, so they can still transmit those things to other people. So, and don't you like this graphic over here your textbook did of the people dancing, and if you got a sexually transmitted disease, STD, I guess you have all these little lights that light up around your pelvis. Incubating carriers. So this is where you're on the way to developing an infectious disease. You're on your way to getting sick. You're in that incubation phase that we talked about, and you just don't know it yet, but you're still capable with some infectious diseases of spreading that to other people. Good example, infectious mononucleosis. Even when you're in the incubation phase, you can spread that to other people. There are convalescent carriers. So now a lot of infectious diseases, when you hit that convalescence phase at the end of the infectious disease where you're recovering, the microbe is gone. Your immune system has wiped it out. But in other cases, you might be a convalescent carrier. So even though you're over the symptoms of disease you're carrying, you're still shedding these microbes. And an example of that is hepatitis A. So hepatitis A virus actually, of course, lives in your liver and causes a severe liver infection, but it can also live in the intestinal tract. So even after it's been cleared from the liver, you may still be shedding this virus. While you're recovering from the hepatitis, you might still be shedding it in your feces because it lives in the intestinal tract as a alternative location. Maybe you guys have heard in the news recently, it's been found that some of the Ebola virus victims still harbor Ebola viruses long after they've recovered. And in some males in semen, they can actually still have Ebola virus in their semen for a pretty long time after they've recovered from the horrible symptoms of that disease. And there was a recent story in the news as well, I believe in the eye, if I'm remembering correctly. They were detecting, oh yes, it was in the iris of the eyes of some Ebola virus victims in Africa. They've discovered that Ebola virus is still present there, for a long time after the symptoms go away, while, long into that convalescence phase for the patient. So, a lot of these things will just vary from one type of pathogen to another. A chronic carrier, this is somebody who you're continuing, so you had an infectious disease and you don't quite clear it out. You just kind of continuously for a very long period of time continue to shed that microorganism, and it can be capable of infecting others. So some examples of this would be tuberculosis, and you know that already. They test people for TB routinely all the time. We've all been tested for that before. If you go into nursing school, you'll have to have a TB test before you start nursing school, and that's because a lot of times people have been exposed to tuberculosis. Maybe you've never had any noticeable symptoms, but they could be chronic carriers. Typhoid fever is caused by a type of salmonella bacteria, and maybe you've heard of the famous case of Typhoid Mary in New York. She was a chronic carrier, and she was a cook, which is probably why they show a cook here in this diagram. And so she just continued to shed this organism into the foods that she was preparing for people, and that launched an epidemic of typhoid fever in New York City. So she was called Typhoid Mary. And then finally, passive carriers. So this is a big one. If you're going into healthcare and you're going to be dealing with patients in any capacity, you have to be careful about trying not to be a passive carrier. So this is where you are working with one patient who's sick, and you pick up microorganisms from that patient on things that you're handling, or it gets on your gloves and your gown and so forth, and then you go over here to another patient's room and you wind up transmitting the microbe to that other patient. So you don't actually become infected, you are simply a passive carrier. The microbe is basically just using you as a means of moving from one patient to another. And this is very common in healthcare. So this occurs with a lot of healthcare associated infections. So a lot of the training you'll undergo if you're going to become a nurse or work with patients in some other capacity is aimed at having you avoid being a passive carrier with a patient. Because you got to be really careful. People in the hospital are sick, their immunity is weak, and so as a healthcare worker, you may get exposed to some dose of a microbe and it doesn't make you sick because you're healthy. But you transmit that dose of a microbe from one patient to another patient who's very weak with low immunity, and they can wind up becoming very ill from that. All right, so that was reservoirs with a little bit of an emphasis on the different types of human carriers. So be sure you review those different types of human carrier states and understand those. In the next video lecture, we're going to talk more about the different modes of transmission for microbes moving from one host to another.